before the whole project started back in 2017, it was pretty much a, here are Excel sheets, please enter your risks and send the Excel sheet back. There was no product on the market that was, let's say, fully covering the requirements. With Firm, as we are having a very, let's say, well-developed form to get the risk data into the system.
Hi Christian, thanks for joining us in the SRI Talks.
Hi Holger, thank you for having me.
You're in the group risk management team and you're the director responsible for ICS and Firm tools that we are developing with you. And you also have been the person that we are working the longest together.
Yeah, actually 2017 as far as I remember. It's so
nearly 10 years.
Almost a decade, yes.
So you also have been part of the IT department, let's say, before. How did your role from then to now evolve, and which challenges do you face?
Well, in my beginning days working on the product, at that point Firm only, but that has evolved to others, it was purely a customer-supplier relationship because, as you mentioned, I was with the central IT department, central IT company at Fresenius. However, when transitioning to Fresenius SE, I became much more embedded into the team developing the methodology as well as the, let's say, thinking process, the design, like why are we doing something? What are the prerequisites and the necessities for this? And this enabled me to allow into the process to get into much earlier, because the thinking process, the design process was not done yet because I was now from the start. And that also enabled us to, make a much more streamlined approach, because previously it was the thinking process was done. Then as a customer, they came to me and I was like, this doesn't work because of that. And obviously that always needed to go back a step to redesign, to rethink. And now being involved much earlier made the whole process much more streamlined, especially aligning with the business segments.
And what challenges do you face now, which you probably did not face before?
The overall process has become much more sophisticated over the past, and that means obviously our products have also matured and have also grown much more sophisticated. So where in the past we had essentially like one risk assessment, like as an example from the Firm, we now have several assessments, we have several factors, several time frames, several things that are contributing. And so the overall estimation of an impact, like, hey, we need this as a new feature. Okay, what does it actually mean? Where are all the places that it's going to touch? Being in the process much earlier means obviously we're going to have a much better product in the end, because being involved earlier, we don't need to take this step back over and over again.
You mentioned it earlier. We developed a team tailored to your needs. How does this process look like within Fresenius and in collaboration with SRI?
Well, actually, we're not really, in a collaboration anymore. Collaboration works from 9 till 5, right? So, but since our beginnings, since we have started to work on, especially with the current team in about 2020, 2021, this has grown into a partnership, because we are now, let's say, having a very open exchange. We are proposing topics, your guys are commenting on this. We are engineering solutions together, especially when it comes to how are we going to implement things from a technology point of view. Because as we moved from the SharePoint on-premise, where the first version of Firm was actually run on, to the Azure platform, obviously also the whole, let's say, range of opportunities grew significantly with all the investments and all the extensions that Microsoft introduced in the recent years. So having, let's say, always like picking the right thing to do the best possible, to get the best possible outcome is obviously, with all the options you have, increasingly difficult. So having someone to be in exchange with, that helps a lot.
You mentioned SharePoint, which was the base platform that we started working on together with you. Since these days, how did the platform evolve?
Well, Fresenius chose to adopt the Microsoft Cloud solutions with M365 and Azure. And as we were investigating possible migration paths, also together with your guys, it became pretty obvious at some point that the capabilities that we had on-premise with the SharePoint, especially when it comes to full scope solutions, this wouldn't be possible on the SharePoint Online anymore. However, good for us, Microsoft also had the cloud platform, Azure, available. So after some analysis of alternatives, we essentially ended up in deciding on this cloud-first approach, which was perfect because it was in line with the strategy of Fresenius overall. because it allowed us to scale very flexibly, to consume services as they become available and to scale them as required, especially in times of more advanced use cases or more heavy usage, for example, during the reporting phase, and then we can scale down the services out of these timeframes, so to save costs, for example.
And this development process is agile or waterfall? How do you work with us, or it's a mix of everything?
It's a little bit of a mix. We're going mostly with the agile approach. However, just to avoid, for example, going in a very granular way, requesting like preparing requirements, requesting effort estimations, and then doing the overall offer process, we are combining a bunch of requirements into what we call the change request sets, just to streamline the overall process, to give us a better feeling when it comes to cost, also how they are evolving, and for you also to be able to get a defined work set and then populate the development pipeline so that we can plan ahead for usually about 6 months.
So you mentioned the cost aspect. So you must have done the analysis, say, own internal development with us compared to standard available market solutions that are there. What was the reason for you, for Fresenius to vote for this development?
Several factors, actually. First of all, our initial investigation in early to mid 2017 revealed that there was no product on the market that was, let's say, fully covering the requirements at an acceptable cost. And the other thing is that when you're buying off the shelf, this may yield initial savings because maybe you're faster to the market, you're faster to your audience. The problem in many cases is that you're buying pretty much from a cost perspective, a black box, because you really don't know like how the supplier, like the service supplier, SaaS solutions, for example, how are the costs for licenses, etc., going to develop. And since at this point it was primarily a Fresenius Kabi-driven product, and they required a global tool, because for the global organization, it was very, very difficult to assess this kind of cost growth down the line. With building your own solution, obviously you have a much higher investment, not only in terms of money, but also in terms of time initially. But since you're not, forced to accept changes in, for example, user license costs or operations license costs from a supplier, it's much better to plan on a mid and long-term basis, like how is your cost for the TCO for your solution going to evolve? So that was one of the things, together with the ability to have, in the future at least, let's say, keep up with an evolving risk management process. Like how are things going to be done? What are required to meet the requirements that we have on the process? And these risk requirements that you mentioned, they are constantly changing, or is it something that you can already forecast? Okay, the next 5 years, that's one of the key challenges, actually, because yes, there are changes coming. There are changes coming from how Fresenius as a business is evolving. There are changes obviously coming from Berlin and Brussels, like the whole regulatory environment, and then there are things, let's say, coming from the segments, from the risk owners or the risk type owners. Sometimes it's just about, convenience. Hey, we are having this right now. It would be more convenient for us like this. So these are the primary sources where requirements are coming from. And obviously, we're trying to weight the priorities here. But overall, as I said, we're looking at a pipeline of about 6 months in the future, because also our reporting is like half years. And that works quite well so far. Okay. And looking at the technical development, and you have made this journey with us for nearly 10 years, let's say, what were the developments, the features which you are really proud of and that stand out? We had several major improvements over the course of time. One is for sure moving away from just a single scenario analysis, which was, let's say, the worst case analysis, into a more distributed analysis, like worst, best, and realistic case, because that is also necessary, the data for the additional evaluations, for example, for a Monte Carlo simulation. What we recently implemented is the multi-time frame assessment. So now we are not only looking at a risk item, which is like, or the risk situation of an item here, but how is this going to evolve probably within the next 12 months or in the 1 year to 3 year time frame, or even longer term. because that is especially for our senior level and top level management important. Like, okay, it's good to know what's like today, but it's equally important to know like how are the risk owners assessing this in the future, because obviously for business development and risk management purposes, this is equally important.
Mainly we talk now about firm. Yeah. How does firm enable the management team to assess and assess the risk situation better?
Well, first of all, it's the single point of truth. All the information that is, maybe let's call it relevant, is in one place. Before the whole project started back in 2017, it was pretty much here are our Excel sheets, please enter your risks and send the Excel sheet back. So there was very little structure, there was very little consistency. With firm, as we are having a very, let's say, well-developed form to get the risk data into the system, we are on the one hand side focusing really on what is necessary. We're not trying to burden stuff on the user that is, beside the point or irrelevant, at least, from optional and mandatory properties. And with this collected and then reviewed and approved as part of the reporting phase process, this enables the management to really look into the system with confidence and say, okay, this is our situation. This is where we can now take decisions or planning or whatever on.
Okay, so far we mainly talked about firm, but how did you experience the development of ICS, which is now in the last 1.5 years has been developed? And what are the major breakthrough features that you have embedded?
Yes, well, the overall process of getting to the point where we are at now is pretty similar to firm, because we also did the analysis for alternatives again. It came to the same conclusion. That's why we initiated the do-it-yourself project. The key differences here are that we were able to do this in a much more structured way when it comes to collecting requirements from the business segments. So from the very start out, we had all the business segments involved. We had representatives from the business segments that were actively, requesting their feedback, requesting their ideas and their requirements to get into the initial release of the product. Because in firm, it was starting out from Kabi, and let's say the individual requirements in firm, they came much later and let's say drip by drip. So with ICS, we are now looking initially already at a much more flexible configuration approach to meet the requirements of the segments. And that is probably already one of the key, advancements over firm. That this is essentially baked in from the start, this configurability approach, and not retrofitted, which isn't bad, but it's, having it from the start is definitely better. Key feature-wise, it's probably the overall sophistication of the UI UX as well as the multi-language capability, which is really unique to ICS at this point.
Great to hear that. And when it comes to firm, due to the long period on the market, let's say within Fresenius, you receive feedback. But how does it look like for ICS, where you're still in the development process? It's going to be launched soon. But how would you say is the feedback already from your peers, internally, externally?
Yeah, we are getting good feedback because I think that's as I mentioned, one of the key advantages, getting them into the project, into the design of the project, involved much earlier than we did with firm. So there aren't, let's say, I wouldn't call it surprises, but there aren't like, oh, you did it like that, but we would have much preferred it if you would have done it like this, for example. So the expectation management is much easier because we are much more closer engaged with them. And yes, I mean, so far it hasn't been rolled out. That's true. But we are pretty much on the last lap to that. So Q1 2026 is going to be the kickoff there. So we'll see.
So you mentioned that you're much closer to the requirements. Is this something that is due to the organizational setup, that you're now part of the business team, or where does it come from?
No, it's a general thing because we already knew when we started ICS who would be the overall audience. Right, firm was initially only for Kabi and then transitioned to SE and then let's say got branched out. At ICS, we knew already, okay, these are all the guys, these are all our stakeholders, these are all our subject matter experts. We need to get them into the project at the earliest possible opportunity to start collecting the requirements really from the start out, right? And that works pretty well. I mean, we have really received good feedback from them, not only from the way that the product is like working, from the like implementing their requirements, but also from a technical point of view.
So this make or buy decision you went through a couple of times, and you voted often for this make it yourself,
Yes,
do it yourself. So it's not for everyone, I would say, or as we understand. But who do you think can consider to develop such solution on their own?
Well, doing a careful analysis first is obviously key to identify the own requirements and then map these to existing products. And if these products simply don't match or only match to a small degree, plus, let's say, the uncertainty on future cost development if you're buying something, that is, and if you can afford it, then it's definitely a good idea to start doing these kind of things for yourself, if it is a long-term product. If it's just an interim solution, then for sure this is not the way to go with. For us here, it was clear from the start out that the success of Firm and MRL and the previous product would also be a good template to work on using to use for working on ICS, right? Because we are now in the early stages here, but this means that we are also going to have a very long run until everything is in the organization, all the data is in, everyone's accustomed to the processes, and so on and so forth. The second, I think, key difference is that if you're having an expert system, sometimes these expert systems simply, let's say, ask for stuff that the regular user has really a hard time answering. And in many cases, the ICS people and also the risk management people, you know, they are not like full-time, it's not their only job, right? They are participating in their main role, in their main job. And beside that, like a kind of a secondary role, that they are having these topics in the ICS or in the risk management area. And if you're having a complex expert system, right, then this can be a hurdle. You need to train them, you need to update them, whatsoever. So our overall purpose and our overall goal is always keep it really simple, you know, lower the hurdles so people are easily onboarded and trained.
So a good user experience is key.
Yes.
Okay. Let's have a look into 2026 and coming years. So when it comes to Firm and ICS, what is in your pipeline? What you would like to develop?
Well, just AI is probably on everyone's mind and everyone's plates these days. So this is also for us. We've started to take initial steps this year already in Firm. We are going to expand on this, and we are also going to introduce it in ICS. We have taken a deliberately, let's say, cautious step or cautious approach here, starting with small steps. And this has so far been working out really well for us. In the future, we want to build on that. We want to expand it in scope, but also in capability. Beside that, ICS and risk management is also having various touch points in the process, and obviously, therefore, also in the data that we are generating. This means that midterm, at least, we want to start bringing together the ICS application and the Firm application much closer, so that the different aspects where there are the touch points, they are really touching points in terms of the application is exchanging data with the other, so that things that are developed, that are recorded, that are, reported in one application where it has impact on the other application, that this is really, the data is flowing from the one to the other to ensure that the overall picture remains consistent and, most importantly, of course, up to date.
You mentioned AI in your pipeline. What exactly should AI help you with?
The processes that we have been implementing in Firm and ICS and also in the other application, they are very heavily people-driven. And to ensure that the consumers of these information that are added, like, you have the initial risk reporter, and then at some later point during the reporting process, other people, other levels of management look at that. And if the information that is entered initially is incomplete, obviously it will lead to an uncertain situation, or it will lead to a lot of, asking questions back and forth, which could delay the overall reporting process. So our approach was, hey, why can't we use AI to validate and review the initial input that the risk contributor is providing to ensure that the relevant questions are answered in that, right? So for example, what is the risk event, right? It's good to have a risk, describe maybe the impact, right? But if you don't report like what is really triggering the risk, then down the line, the management would say, okay, now we have a risk, but we don't know why it could happen. So this we have been using AI, large language models, to review this and then support the user like in a little traffic light KPI thing. Okay, this question is answered well, and maybe you have some improvements here. And that way, we already have seen a significant increase in the information that is added, and also a good improvement in the overall quality of the risk descriptions that are entered. Likewise in ICS, there we have the controls, and essentially it's the same situation, right? The description of them needs to answer a couple of questions, and this is what we are matching the user input against.
So, Christian, thank you very much for spending the time with us and sharing your knowledge and insights about ICS and firm within Fresenius.
Thank you, Holger, for having me. Looking forward to the next.
Thank you for watching this episode, and hopefully see you soon in the next one.